So thank you for all of you coming out today in memory of Pat Weinberger. She did so much for this valley, and towards the end of her life, I was very fortunate to be able to spend time almost every day with her. I would go over to her house and get her breakfast and spend an hour with her, getting her out of bed. And when she tells stories, I'd write them down when I got home. So those stories all form the basis of what I'm saying today. And they start in the early years of her life and continue through her active time in Ojai. There are several people that weren't able to be here today that would have liked to be, but they had previous engagements, and that includes Hannah Jackson, Brooks and Kate Firestone, and Pat's good friends, Fred and Judy Bish, and Tom Malley, and former supervisor John Flynn. So we will send a copy of this text out to them and to anyone else that wants it afterwards. So thank you all for being here. Pat was born in Akron, Ohio on September 23rd, 1923. Her family was originally from Philadelphia. Her parents were Charles and Lily Dunkley, her dad managing about 20 drivers and delivery trucks for a tobacco company. She had a happy childhood with one set of grandparents living close by. Her parents detested FDR and were staunch Republicans, as was Pat, until she met Larry Weinberger. 3 of her most enduring relationships were formed in her earliest years. At her kindergarten, she got to know Landon Knight, who would inherit the newspaper chain of the same name, more recently the Knight Ridder Company, the second largest newspaper chain in the nation. At her elementary school, King's School in Akron, she also got to know John Seiberling, whose parents founded the Goodyear Tire Company. He lived in a 112-room mansion which had been taken apart and moved there from England. John Seiberling would go on to become a very liberal congressman from Ohio, who saw to the protection of more wilderness areas than any other single legislator ever achieved. 49 million acres in Alaska alone. He also wrote the impeachment papers for President Nixon. 4 decades after they first met, Pat would look to him to create the Teague Memorial watershed around Lake Casitas. She also knew the Firestone family from school in Akron and went horseback riding on their property. Pat's friend Susie Johnson, married to Dr. Gordon Johnson, who later moved to Ventura, she met at Camp Tuanicota in Chautauqua, New York, a summer camp. One of them was refusing to eat a bowl of tapioca, and they became lifelong friends. Susie's father was Dr. Carl Arnstein, who designed blimps, and Pat was able to brag of having early birthday parties in a blimp flying above Akron, Ohio. How cool is that? Wow. She was sent to boarding school, Hannah More Academy in Reisterstown, Maryland, in her mid-teens, but only stayed for a few weeks. During the Thanksgiving vacation, she insisted on not going back. "I was an only child, you know," she said by way of explanation, like we didn't know that. Pat joined the Junior League in Akron, Ohio, part of a prestigious nationwide young women's organization that focused on volunteerism. This was the beginning of a lifetime of civic engagement, and here was where she learned her extraordinary organizational skills. Her first husband, whom she must have married around the age of 20, was Captain Kenneth Richards, who served in the Air Force and died in the Pacific in World War II. Pat's life was touched by polio. Landon Knight was crippled from childhood polio and confined to a wheelchair. She herself contracted a mild case of the disease, which allowed her to work safely as a volunteer in the local polio hospital. There she met and worked with Jonas Salk, the creator of the polio vaccine. This hospital was also where she later met Larry Weinberger. Around this time, the actor John Lithgow, then a young lad, lived with his dad at Pat's house. The dad, an actor, needed a place to live, and Pat recalled young John climbing a tree in the garden and breaking a branch off it. But first it's time to talk about Herb Vale Dwight, Pat's second husband and the father of her 2 children. Pat described him as elegant, a prince of the realm. He came from an old founding fathers family, the Dwights of Yale, and before the polio, he had been captain of the Yale swim team. His profession was corporate troubleshooter. Rosalind was born in 1951 and Mike some years later. Tragedy struck within a few years, and tragedy was unfortunately an occurrence that repeated through her long life. Pat had prepared a birthday dinner for one of the children when the phone rang to inform her that Herb, whom she'd expected to see walking in the door at any moment, had died in a hotel fire at the end of his business trip. Pat did not hold back if she wanted a man. Over the years, Pat described several conquests of men she was attracted to. I assume that these took place between her first two husbands, as her relationship with Larry Weinberger began soon after Herb's death. She mentioned Jonas Salk, creator of the polio vaccine, Trace Pittenger, chief counsel for General Tire, and Arthur Kornberg, later a 1959 Nobel Prize-winning physician. After Larry had died, she later told me she nearly married Archie Bard, the widower of Carla Bard. And of Thad Hyland, a former manager of the Ojai Valley Inn, she once told me, if I was 40 years younger, he'd be in trouble. Landon Knight's love for Pat was lifelong. He proposed to her many times, but his polio disability doomed that turn of events. Nevertheless, Landon, who died in 2003, named two of his prize racehorses after her, Pretty Patty and Peninsula Peach. Pat was then living in Peninsula, Ohio, near Akron. So now we come to Dr. Larry Weinberger, the perfect partner for Pat and another Yale man. They knew one another from the polio hospital before Herb died. As Pat said, they both chased each other at that point. Larry fell in love with her in her Red Cross uniform at the hospital. But Larry was already married. Not that that stopped them for one moment. The Akron newspapers mentioned the scandal. The Akron Junior League knew that Pat would fight being thrown out of the organization. The problem for the Junior League was twofold. Larry was married, and he was Jewish. Pat's dad had died, and her mother, who loved Larry, kept her mouth shut. That's Pat's words. When Pat and Larry eventually married, the Society column headline read, "Pat weds Doc." Larry's ex-wife ended up with a house in town and most of their assets. Larry kept the cabin on 40 acres in Peninsula, Ohio. Thus began the happiest years of her life. Larry, being a neurosurgeon, had a very good income, and Pat had assets from her house in Akron. Together they planned and had built a beautiful large house on the 40-acre site, and a lake was constructed just below it. Larry was a consulting neurosurgeon at 5 separate hospitals, and Pat says she never cooked dinner for just the two of them. Doctors from the 5 hospitals were frequent guests and helped to maintain the large vegetable garden for a share of the harvest. There were parties at all seasons. In winter, warmly dressed guests would ride sleds down the slope out onto the frozen lake, and food and drink would be served outside with music playing from outdoor loudspeakers. Pat kept 5 or more fireplaces burning all day long. Larry chopped the wood. In summer, one could fish in the lake from a boat, and Pat and Larry had a habit of pushing one another into the lake from the dock. Pat says they never argued. Their relationship was impulsive, but they were very compatible. Larry would drink champagne from her shoe, and, this is the good part, he would practice his one-handed surgeon's knot tying skills by tying her toe to the bedpost with fishing line. That makes quite a picture. Pat and Larry attended the first march in Washington, D.C. against the Vietnam War, along with the entire medical faculty of Case Western Reserve Medical School in Cleveland, one of the world's top medical schools. Larry had attained the rank of general in the U.S. Army, serving as a surgeon in World War II in frontline hospitals in North Africa and then in Italy. Later he was sent to Russia to aid in saving the lives of soldiers with serious head injuries. Some decades later, when Pat and Larry were on a cruise in the Baltic, their ship docked at St. Petersburg. The Russians had researched the passenger list ahead of time, and as an expression of their gratitude for Larry's wartime work, the two of them were surprised on the dock by a full military band, and a formal reception dinner was held that night in Larry's honor. Another magical night occurred when Pat and Larry were stuck at Oberlin College Auditorium in the Midwest during a snowstorm. Among the 20 or so stranded travelers happened to be Louis Armstrong and his band. The band played through the night, and Larry gave Louis Armstrong a neurological examination. So now we come towards their 1968 arrival in Ojai. On a Caribbean wintertime vacation, Pat and Larry shared a dinner table with a couple who talked about visiting Ojai to go horseback riding over the Christmas season. Hearing Ohio instead of Ojai, the Weinbergers were mystified. Nobody goes to Ohio in winter to ride horses. After further questioning, they understood what and where Ojai was, and they decided to visit. That was a very fortunate dinner-time conversation for the future of the Ojai Valley. Pat's oldest female friend, Susie Johnson, and her physician husband, Gordon, were by now living in Ventura. Pat and Larry drove up towards Ojai on Highway 33. Larry tried to turn around 3 times as they passed through Oakview. He was not impressed by the gateway to the Ojai Valley. Pat insisted on continuing. They checked in at the Ojai Valley Inn, and the next morning they took a walk. Finding themselves on the Del Oro tract, which at that time was mostly undeveloped, they fell in love with the site at 701 and placed an offer for it that same day. They also purchased a vacant lot next door as an open space buffer. Together they planned their new home there and rented a house elsewhere while it was built. Partway through they fired the contractor, whom Pat described as a crook. Larry had had a heart attack around this time, which persuaded him to quit the operating room and to focus instead on the consulting room. He was a board-certified neurosurgeon, a board-certified neurologist, and a board-certified psychiatrist. Pat had never lived in a small town before. She joined the International League of Women for Peace and Freedom, which organized candlelight vigils against the Vietnam War, shoulder to shoulder from Montgomery Street to the post office. She also saw how a good old boy network of right-wing developers was running the city. It included city manager Jack Blaylock, chief of police Jim Alcorn, and 2 realtors under the name Ojai Futures Unlimited. Pat attended one city council meeting and saw what she had to do. In her words, get the city manager fired and get rid of the city council. It took her 2 years to turn the council around. Pat also jumped into environmental activism right away. Among her early campaigns was stopping the construction of a freeway through Ojai from Carpentria to Santa Paula on the Highway 150 route, and her successful opposition to the 4-laning of Highway 33 all the way from Casita Springs right into the city. Pat says she was burned in effigy by supporters of the 4-laning proposal. The campaign that Pat is most proud of was the creation of the Teague Memorial watershed around the edge of what was then the new Lake Casitas. Pat found out early on that the watershed was zoned for 10,000 single-family homes, which would have allowed for a potential brand new city of 25,000 residents on 5 square miles of land west of the lake. This was when she sought the support of her early childhood friend John Seiberling, by then a congressman from Ohio, and a champion of public lands preservation. Thus, 3,500 acres of the watershed were protected from development starting in 1974, and the lake's water quality was protected from a substantial source of contamination. Congressman Teague, for whom the watershed was named, was a Republican from an old Santa Paula family who had died suddenly while in bed with a woman other than his wife. Pat continued to be a lifelong and ardent supporter of Lake Casitas, keeping a pontoon boat there which was used for many hundreds of dinner parties on the lake, liberally supplied with champagne and Pat's delightful cooking. She championed the bird life and the peaceful atmosphere of an evening afloat on Lake Casitas. Many years later, she successfully stopped a proposal that would have allowed swimming and body contact with our local drinking water supply there. Eventually, she replaced her party boat with an all-electric one, which silently hummed around the lake. She founded, organized, and led 2 important environmental organizations, the Citizens to Preserve the Ojai, and the county-wide Environmental Coalition, both of which then had many hundreds of members who could be counted on to get involved and to show up and testify at public hearings. The other really major campaign that Pat led was the opposition to U.S. Gypsum's proposal in the early 1970s to construct numerous open-pit phosphate mines on the slope south of Pine Mountain at an elevation of 6,000 feet east of the summit of Highway 33. The beautiful mountainside that forms the northern rim of the Sespe watershed was to have been floodlit all night to allow the 24-hour mining of a 5-mile stretch of hillside. 500,000 gallons of concentrated sulfuric acid was to have been stored on site, and Godwin Creek, an upper Sespe tributary, was to be dammed to hold acidic mine tailings. The main impact to Ojai from the phosphate mining would have been the convoys of up to 100 truck and trailer rigs coming down Highway 33 through Ojai every day of the week, 24 hours a day. Long before this tactic became customary, Larry and Pat bought stock in U.S. Gypsum and traveled to a shareholders meeting in Chicago to speak publicly about the Pine Mountain mining proposal. The U.S. Department of the Interior held all-day public hearing on the phosphate mining proposal at Nordhoff High School, attended by California's 2 senators, Cranston and Tunney, in front of 1,800 concerned citizens. Pat spearheaded the public opposition. In the end, the project was dropped when an enormous new deposit of phosphate was discovered elsewhere in the world, causing the price to drop substantially. Without local opposition, which slowed the project down, the mines would have been in operation long before the drop in price. Pat also put stop to a motorcycle racetrack on the field past the top of Denison Grade, and to an early 1970s proposal for an Albertsons supermarket on the open field on Highway 33 opposite the Nordhoff Stadium, on property owned by Ed Carty. This would have put Ojai's then Safeway and Bayless markets out of business. Pat got permission from some of the Chamber of Commerce board members to gather signatures against the project near the Oaks Hotel. Ken Johnson and a lady called Betty Fielder, whom Pat described as having carbon black hair and a heart to match, threw Pat out of the public place where she was gathering names. The campaign went on for a long time, and the Ojai City Council voted it down, but it didn't end there. Pat got a referendum on the ballot, and the shopping center went down to defeat by a ratio of 3.5 to 1. Pat's only other referendum was not successful. Her campaign to keep Ojai's police service cops. Pat and Ojai Councilman Jim Lobel knew that contracting out the local police force would lead to its becoming the most expensive item in the city budget. This is the only record I have of Pat not winning a campaign she took on. Ojai was very fortunate in those days to have an activist owner-editor of the Ojai Valley News. Fred Volz covered all the development battles in great detail and editorialized loudly and clearly about any number of threats to the Ojai Valley. Melody Gillard was the paper's star reporter, and Pat and Fred, along with Polly B., spent many evenings together strategizing, with a drink in hand. Pat also wrote 2 years' worth of columns for the Ojai Valley News under the heading Centering on Government. This is what Fred Volz wrote about Pat. Appalled by public indifference to the despoliation of the magnificent and world-renowned Ojai Valley, the exploitation of its natural resources, the conversion of its river plain into oil fields and its agricultural land into shopping centers and housing tracts, the placing of refineries on the coast and oil derricks on the slopes of mountains, the reckless and senseless sprawl of development, as well as the general acceptance that ugliness, environmental destruction, and polluted air and water were the norms of life, Pat rolled up her sleeves and went to work. Pat's work included one, opposition to many projects outside the Ojai Valley under the umbrella of the Environmental Coalition of Ventura County. She was successful in the blocking of 2 of the 4 proposed electrical generating units for Southern California Edison's Ormond Beach power plant. At the Ormond Beach public hearing, then Thousand Oaks supervisor Appleton called Pat a communist, told her to watch what she said, and reminded her that there was a marshal at the door. The proposed expansion of the petrochem oil refinery adjacent to the 33 freeway also came up in the 1980s. Pat's work helped to lead the refinery's closing down instead. The early 1980s saw the threat of uranium mining in the Superior Ridge area of the Lake Casitas watershed by Homestake Mining. This was opposed by a group of Ojai citizens under the banner "Sun, Stop Uranium Now." Ultimately, this threat was stopped after Pat persuaded Congressman Bob Lagomasino to introduce legislation in D.C. to prohibit uranium mining in the Casitas watershed. The most recent big campaign in the Ojai Valley was the opposition in the 1990s to Weldon Canyon as West Ventura County's new landfill. In spite of clear and detrimental air quality impacts from the hundreds of trash truck trips per day, the Weldon Canyon landfill proposal to be operated by Waste Management, Inc. was moving forward. Weldon Canyon is situated south of the 33 freeway and west of Casitas Springs. Ojai resident Carl Hunsinger, as a board member of Southern California Edison, not your traditional environmental activist, led the opposition to the Weldon Canyon landfill. But unknown to most is the last-minute role that Pat played in changing the key vote of then Oxnard Supervisor John Flynn, whose district had been home to the West County's previous landfill. Pat and John Flynn had been close friends for a long time. Pat said, never say that you've got a supervisor's vote on any issue. Never take credit away from a politician for doing the right thing. However, after the passage of 2 decades, this story bears telling. After a lunch together at the Ojai Valley Inn, Pat figured she'd better take John Flynn home to her house for a nap, as he'd had a bit too much to drink. She called John's wife Diane to tell her the plan. Carl Hunsinger called later in the afternoon to ask if Pat had talked to John Flynn about the upcoming Weldon Canyon decision, to which she answered, "I've got him in bed." Carl said, "What?" Later that evening, Carl Hunsinger, Pat, and John and Diane Flynn went for dinner to Seafresh, where the supervisor was persuaded to vote against the Weldon Canyon landfill proposal. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that a few drinks change the supervisor's mind. John Flynn is one of my favorite politicians. He once stated at a public hearing that Los Padres Forest is a sacred place, not exactly a common sentiment from a legislator. He also traveled to D.C. to testify that Sespe Creek should be preserved, not dammed. It was Pat's articulate and well-prepared powers of persuasion that changed his mind about Weldon Canyon. A similar thing happened in the final few weeks of the Farmont Golf Course proposal, which was situated adjacent to Rancho Matilaha. Opposition to this elite international golf course had dragged on for a decade. The Japanese developer had died, and the project had been purchased by a New York company. Pat was again instrumental right at the key moment in 2002 in securing the vital third vote from Supervisor John Flynn to oppose the project and to terminate the proposal forever. Most of that property was later purchased with statewide open space bond funding and is now the Ventura River Preserve. Pat chaired the re-election campaigns of many local elected officials, and she was as tireless and fearless in this role as in all others. She never actually retired from her life of activism. "As long as I can get 3 votes," she said, "you can put that on my tombstone." She once told me that she needed an enemy. For most of the George W. Bush years, she kept a small cloth doll representing Dick Cheney hanging from her reading light, and she would regularly stick pins in it. The tragedies I referred to earlier were that Pat was predeceased by all of her 3 husbands and both of her children. Both Larry and Rosalind died a few months apart in 1989. That must have been a really tough year. Rosalind was an architect living in Portland. She and Pat were extremely close. Pat described Rosalind as always soft-spoken, but able to be tougher than her mother. She died of cancer at the age of 38.
Gosh.
Mike and Pat were not close. I think he left home around the age of 18 and didn't keep in touch with his mother and Larry, though he did end up living in Camarillo, where he ran a pest control company. In later years, he and his partner would come up to Ojai for dinner with Pat on Christmas Eve, but that was it for the year. When he also came down with cancer, Pat looked after him for a few weeks after he was released from the hospital. Mike had 2 children with his first wife, Colette, who's here today. But Pat had no interest whatsoever in meeting them. I have no explanation for that. Pat's loss of both her children led her to create a memorial for children who had predeceased their parents. It's situated at the Y in Ojai, a row of 98 small posts at ground level at the back of the corner with the big rock. That rock was another Pat project. It was a thank you to the hundreds of firefighters who protected Ojai during the 1985 fire that burned all the hills to the north of the valley from Highway 33 east to the Toba Toba Bluffs. 120,000 acres in all. Relatively few homes were lost. The children's memorial grew and grew. Pat was not going to put a limit on it. She ended up listening on the phone to all of the sad, heartbreaking stories told her by the parents who wanted their 96 children's names added to the memorial. What unbelievable patience and compassion that must have taken on Pat's part. I asked her once if she was happy. She said not since Larry died, but she was content. For her own obituary, and we talked about this quite a few times, she wanted a notice in the press that said simply, Pat Weinberger loved men, dogs, cats, champagne, and Lake Casitas. That's it. Pat did have more men friends than women friends. If you'd ask her about a specific woman she knew, she was more likely to say, that dumb broad. On the other hand, she had some very close women friends and activists, and several times she described a local politician's wife as being the brains behind the politician husband. Some of her closest friends were cops, in particular Sheriff John Gillespie and Vince France. She was one of the guys, and they called her Patrick. At times when she'd received threats to her life, during the Bottle Bill recycling campaign of all things, John Gillespie would park his patrol car in the street and sleep on the sofa in Pat's living room for a few nights. Pat did pack a small pistol, and she was known to sit at the end of her driveway of an evening with a pistol and a glass of whiskey. If the coyotes were around that might be after her large, beloved, extended family of feral cats. I know that at least once she let loose a bullet at a coyote down the street. I don't think she hit it. Then there were her dogs, greater Swiss mountain dogs, Minnie and Maxie. I know how big they were, as I buried them both. Larry used to drive them daily down to the ice cream store and buy them each a cone, which they ate in the back of the van. Did any of you know that Pat was actually married 4 times, although she only had 3 husbands? After the Ojai house was built, Larry's ex-wife in Ohio learned about it and tried to go after the property. The solution, Pat and Larry got divorced, leaving the house in Pat's name until it was safe to get remarried. I rarely remember Pat ever hesitating to answer a question. She knew her position on a topic immediately. In terms of being in charge of her own life, which she most certainly was, she said, "We make our own luck." On one occasion I asked if she believed in past lives. Without hesitation she answered, "Eleanor of Aquitaine." I just looked her up this week. She was the most eligible bride in 12th century Europe, as well as one of the wealthiest and most powerful women of her time. She married King Louis VII of France, but received a papal dispensation for a divorce, to annul the marriage 15 years later, as she'd been unable to bear a son and heir. And just 8 short weeks later, she married the man who was soon to become King Henry II of England, who she produced 5 sons for. As to what made Ojai special, Pat attributed it to the influence of the Theosophists who made their home here about 100 years ago. If you asked her about all the work she did for the benefit of our valley, she'd simply say, "I had a really good time." One time Pat was eating dinner at some event in the East County, and she noticed a particularly good-looking man a few seats away. She told him he ought to be in the movies. Turned out the man she was addressing was Tom Selleck. Pat had many allies and helpers when she got a campaign going. Some of them were situated on public boards, the county supervisors, the Ojai City Council, the Planning Commission, or the Air Pollution Control District. She networked tirelessly, and nobody doubted for a minute who was running the show. She'd always sit in the front row at public meetings, wearing her signature oversized red-rimmed glasses. I wish I had a pair of those for my mantelpiece. Pat also believed strongly about a woman's right to choose and was active on the board of Planned Parenthood of Ventura County. She organized fundraising dinners at Alan and Helen Hooker's Ranch House restaurant in Miners Oaks, and often the diners had to make their way past a line of cops holding back dozens of angry protesters. At times she would campaign for moderate Republican politicians. Brooks Firestone of Santa Barbara County comes to mind. He was also a supporter of Planned Parenthood. While a California assemblyman, he honored Pat with the California Woman of the Year award, one of many awards she received. Pat had ridden horses with Brooks's uncle Raymond at their farm in Bath, Ohio, back in elementary school. Pat was also a keen advocate for food share of Ventura County. I must thank the staff at the Autumn Years home in Oakview who took very good care of Pat in her final couple of years. So in closing, please for a moment imagine a very different Ojai Valley. Imagine another city of 25,000 people to the west of Lake Casitas. Imagine 5 miles of open-pit phosphate mines atop Pine Mountain, with dusty trucks passing through town day and night. Imagine a 4-lane freeway passing right through Ojai on its way from Santa Paula to Carpinteria. Imagine a giant Albertsons supermarket opposite the Nordhoff High School bleachers. Imagine the bustling Weldon Canyon landfill. Imagine the air pollution from an Ormond Beach power plant twice the size of the one there now. I think you get the picture. Others might have made some dents in these proposals, but without Pat Weinberger's drive, organizational skills, and political savvy, most of those developments would have moved ahead. But before you think, thank God for Pat, I suggest instead, thank Pat for Pat. I'm sure her spirit is around here someplace watching this event. So let's have a standing ovation for Pat, please.
Excellent. Thanks, Alasdair.
So the microphone is available for anyone to tell stories. I know there's lots of stories I never heard, so please come and make use of this for a minute.
You said we could have a copy of that, right?
Yeah.
Well, I can't believe no one's going to tell us that.
Go for it.
So I have a transcript, obviously, so what I read, and I can email that to anybody. I've got a sign-up sheet on this clipboard, so afterwards, if you put your name down there, I'll send you a copy with some pictures.
Oh, that's good.
Thank you.
Well, I can't believe no one's going to tell Pat's story, since we all have dozens, but I'm going to tell at least one, probably one of my favorites involving the red sunglasses. Pat and I and others were at a sheriff's dinner, something honoring the sheriffs. Very big dinner. The sheriffs were getting a little carried away and a bit, shall I say, I won't say the O word, but you know what I mean. They were really kind of out of control up there on the stage. I was getting offended, but I didn't want to say anything. Pat stood up, marched up to the stage, took the red sunglasses, put them on, glared at every single county sheriff officer there, and they did stop for a minute. And then she took them off and marched out the door and slammed it behind her. I was so thrilled because I got to go too. And you know, there's just so many others. So I have so many things to be grateful to Pat for. And this is great, Alasdair, and everyone, thank you. Now someone's got to have a story, come on. Don't be shy, Pat wasn't. Thank you, John.
I'm Johnny Johnston. I'll just stay up here. And Larry and Pat and I became friends in 1971. And whenever I want to thank Alasdair for doing this, we had several people try to set up a memorial. Unfortunately, the power of attorney for these things was vested in a good friend of Pat's, who for whatever reasons chose to do things differently or was unavailable. I'm not sure all the reasons. So thank you, Alasdair, for bringing us together and to remind us of what, particularly of what one citizen can do. History has been observed by historians as the lies we choose to believe, starting out in myth and then being, written in stone. I want to commend Alasdair. He and I, for the last 10 years of Pat's life, saw her pretty much daily and listened to the story. Sometimes the stories came out a little different as to whether it was at a dinner party or on the beach somewhere in the Caribbean where she first heard of Ojai and misunderstood, but the other facts are accurate. Susie and Gordon are Johnstons, and that's the only reason I bring that up is I'm a Johnston, and we're still trying to put the T back in our names. But the one thing I would like to say about Pat, to correct Alasdair's very kind record, is he said that she lost one campaign. Alasdair, I believe, in fact, she did not lose that campaign. She changed her mind. Because when she talked with me and John Gillespie, who was a very dear friend of hers, by then was in the sheriff's office, and Vince France was the chief of police here, that they all agreed that they could provide a higher level of service at a lower cost. And the budget was always, the police departments are always the biggest part of your municipal budgets everywhere in the world, just about, and maybe with good reason. So with those minor corrections to history, Patricia Weinberger was a force of nature. She was not always right, and she was not always accurate. I don't know if you know Michelle's husband, Andy, back in those days, was also a very close friend of Pat's, and between she did like people in positions of authority, and then she'd take them down if she didn't like their decisions. She was a person who was touched by polio. Her second husband, as was FDR, the president that was not cared for by her family. And you may know, if you're a historian, that FDR was, a book was written called A Traitor to His Class. And Pat used to lift a glass of scotch and say, "As am I," and then talk about the days of the Firestones and all of that, which I'm glad you got all that down, Alasdair, because it's more remarkable when you know how a person starts out in life, and she was tough, but she would change her mind, and she pretty much touched most everything in the community. But we have here Dottie Lobel. Is Dottie still with us? Yeah, there Dottie is. Dottie and Jim Lobel share in much of what Pat did. And there was another example where, starting out as, what do they call them, frenemies? There used to be, if you ever want some fun reading, see if the newspapers will give you the archives of the letters to the editor that Jim and Larry wrote. Jim referred to Larry as Larry the Lizard, and Larry referred to Jim as St. James of the Arbolata. And yet, with Jim's passing, Pat was the first one to be there and to praise all of the things that Jim would do, standing up mostly alone for many years, trying to give a different point of view that helped change the valley. I'll wind it up with the outcome of the issue of the, what was it, the Albertsons Market. The plan was, in those days when Pat arrived, was to move the center of town to the highway. She not only stopped that, I arrived shortly after the first effort. I was the fourth manager in 6 months. And during the 3 years I spent here, we had an election every 6 months, including a recall and a referendum. One of the reasons I have re-entered our local politics is I sense we have come back to that era, and we got to figure out a way to be less divisive. But the outcome of that woman's strength and the people she organized went all the way to the Supreme Court, and instead it created the law for planning law for California. So the things she did are, you never know where it's going to go when you start it, but she didn't care much, as Alasdair said, that she had a good time, said what she meant what she said, corrected it if there was a change, and it was bottoms up, cheers, and in the end, even though she was a tough fighter, she was pretty friendly even with the enemies, and that's quite a tribute to a person of character. So anyway, Michelle, thanks for being here. Okay, is there any?
And to everyone.
By the way, we also, I don't want to neglect, Supervisor Steve Bennett is here, and another person who is a stalwart for our environment. Everybody here is important, but Bill, you have a picture.
Yes, Bill should say something.
Yeah, thank you, Bill.
Hi, I'm Bill Moses, and I came to know Pat through not through politics or anything that was controversial. I met Pat in 1993, and my appreciation for Pat really came through her love for art and architecture. And so my oftentimes weekly visits with her weren't really vitriolic or antagonistic like we all know she could be when she had a mission and a cause. It was really about the love and beauty of fine art, architecture. We'd oftentimes talk about her daughter and her love for her daughter, being an architect, and we'd go through art books, we'd look at the new art that she bought, and so I think there was another side of Pat that I was fortunate enough to tap into, which was this woman that saw beauty, not just controversy. And through that beauty, she found a real great sense of relief, happiness, and so I was really, really fortunate to know her in that realm. The last time I saw her, I was with Johnny, and I got a call out to Steve only because she had a picture. I think, Johnny, you brought a picture of Supervisor Bennett. And while a lot of the conversation today was about John, I want to say that, and this is not gratuitous, but that obviously Steve had a big influence with Pat and vice versa. So thank you, Steve, for everything you brought to her. Because my last time I saw her, Johnny, was a tribute to you and a beautiful photo of you and her. So thank you too. So,
How can we not, as Native peoples, honor this woman? I see before me many, many people who have contributed to the welfare and the love of this valley. You know who you are, in many forms, in many ways, in many fashions. So we are all here hoping that Pat is going to be out there when we need her in that moment of angst. Give us strength. Let us unite together in all the work that we are all still doing, and for those who've come before us and what has been done and set for this valley and what we see our future to be. I haven't known Pat very well. She got us involved with Weldon Canyon, and it was there when I found that we do have a voice where for many decades and many centuries we did not. So as we glean from all that energy and all that power and all that just vision that certain people have and carry on in this world and share with people and unite people and bring people together for a cause that is just so important, and that is the protection of this Mother Earth. Her power, there's a song in our culture. This had enough in the atmosphere. I'm gonna put that down. But as we move in this world, we look outside ourselves. And it's hard to get to know somebody personally when they're doing all the things they're doing. They're never home. They're always out there in the world doing this and doing that. So, I am so grateful for people like Pat and people like you here that are doing the work that you are doing, and may we continue forever. Iseriwa, Iseriwa, Iseriwa. Dios kaskoko, abalakuiena lapai, kuino keopte, pakwanini hu kuwai kui, ichayuet kataog, itimitio kanache lapai,
ula mugu, ula, ila, ulau sauko u, peke yup kunansiani yup, uku ayamog, kana kuwai, kuwai sauko u, suku tunuhun, ute yagamayo, steke yup, ileu, il aoteo. Amen. That was the Lord's Prayer in our Ventureño Chumash language. And where the words come from a particular set of rules and regulations as Catholicism, the words themselves are very meaningful. And where our ancestors used and said this prayer in their language, we knew that they were talking to their deities, their ancestors, and their Mother Earth, Father Sky, and all the deities around here in this valley. For our strength as women, boy, she is someone to really look up to and know that we are equal in this place. We are in this valley of Ojai, moon, female deity. So we sing a sister song, one that was sung to the brother who was cruel and mean. And as he was sent out into the valley grew wide and long, the sun came down and was hot. And when the sisters came upon his dried up bones, they sang a song to him. And they resurrected him again, and he was then transformed into a much more open, much more generous of heart, and loving, and respectful. So as women, we remain powerful. Weni hey ni yo, weni hey ni yo, weni hey ni yo, weni hey ni yo. Weni hey ni yo, weni hey ni yo, weni hey ni yo, weni hey ni yo. Itam tayam go, come to come high mai. Witam tayam go, come to come high. Weni hey ni yo, weni hey ni yo. Weni hey ni yo, weni hey ni yo. Pat, wherever you are, I know you're traveling the world, because outside of ourselves right here, for a second, we are safe. She's out there. She's already out. Her spirit is strong. She is flying around looking where there's so much more need, where there's devastation. We are so fortunate to not be in the situation that we find half our world in today. We still have our battles. So when she's here, when you think of her, when you think outside of yourselves, for all of us here still on this planet, right here in this community, when you think of them, they're calling you. There is that ancient line of communication that we ignore as, oh yeah, where's that name coming from? Why is it popping into my head? Call them, because they're in need, or they want to tell you something, or there's a message. So I thank you for this moment, for coming together and honoring this amazing person. And we, again, continue on into the future. Iseriwa, may it continue indefinitely. Aho, to all my relations.
Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here to celebrate Pat together today. It's a great crowd. And if anyone wants a copy of what I read out, put your name on the clipboard before you go. It's a pleasure to have been able to put this on.
Thank you.